So, I bought a boat and a house. This channel is mainly about boat though, and the myriad of projects, big and small, required to save and improve her. So, welcome to Saving Ophelia. Last time we had a look at how I got Ophelia ready to move again for her first trip in about 8 years. This time we're going to have a look at how that trip went, and that was, let's say, interesting. So, let's get started. I did show you guys how we got the engine back online and how we started it up for the first time in a long while. But I neglected to show you guys how we had to, well, let's say, botch things to get that far. The control panel for the engine used to be mounted in the cockpit. Makes sense, where would you otherwise have it? But apparently it had been leaking, so it had been unmounted and moved inside, and the hole for the mounting had been glassed over. But in this process, a few functions had been ruined apparently. It no longer showed RPM, and also temperature warning for the engine didn't really pop up. At any rate, the main functions were still available. Well, so we thought, because we couldn't really check it. See, the main function of the panel would be to turn on the engine, and we were missing the key for the ignition lock. So when we started the engine the first time, we actually hotwired our own boat. And then later the panel was reworked by my brother, and it ended up looking something like this. I've later replaced a few buttons myself, but this was it in general terms. And while there isn't a lot in the form of information, it's functional, it can turn on the engine, and that's what it needs to do. So we got the steering and the engine back, and then I didn't do a lot of things with the boat for quite a while. Instead, my wife and I bought a house at the other end of the country and moved ourselves and all our stuff, everything except the boat, there on the 4th of November 2021. Having moved, we could hardly leave Ophelia at Lynetten where she was. That was the harbour where she'd been for a long time. Having a boat that was a ferry trip and 240-ish kilometers away while working on it hardly seemed like a tenable plan. There were also other issues that made this a non-starter, so I planned to move Ophelia, and I planned to do it in several stages. See, it's a fairly long trip, and Ophelia is hardly fast, and night sailing without AIS and radar and, well, working position lights is not really a good idea, so I split up the trip into 4 stages. I made sure that each stage was shorter than what Ophelia should be able to manage in a day, including a small buffer. First, we would sail the 50 nautical miles from Lynetten to Klintholm, then the 30 nautical miles from Klintholm to Vordingborg, then 38 nautical miles from Vordingborg across the Great Belt to Spodsbjerg, and finally the 25 nautical miles from Spodsbjerg to Ophelia's new home port of Marstal. I would have preferred to leave Ophelia at Lynetten, the harbour where she'd been for quite a while, at least until the summer of 2022, but the right to use the slip Ophelia was in didn't come with the boat, so we could use it until the end of the summer season and then get an extension into the winter season because, well, the harbour would be empty, most of the boats would be on land, but come the start of the next summer season we would be out of luck. Lynetten had a quite substantial waiting list at the time, around 5 years or so, and the chance of us jumping that waiting list and getting a summer slip for the following summer was next to zero. There was also another issue that made time a pressing concern. There's a major construction project going on in the harbour of Copenhagen where they're building Lynetteholmen, a huge artificial island, and the start of that project ran the risk of closing off the harbour for an unknown amount of time, leaving us stuck, quite possibly beyond the time where we had the right to use the slip, and that leave us paying harbour fees, and harbour fees being what they are, getting stuck wasn't an option. I didn't feel comfortable enough around Ophelia though to sail her entirely on my own. Well, sailing I could do, but for tying up I would have liked to have an extra set of hands because, well, even though the summer season would start at April 1st, there weren't enough crazy people around to be sure that I could have someone help me tie her up. So yeah, I needed extra hands. Also, I wanted the engineer to be there for her first trip out in the open, just to make sure that there weren't any issues with the engine. So instead of staying where we are and risk getting stuck, I decided to move Ophelia to a nearby harbour where there were plenty of temporary slips available. So I had a mate of mine, a friend who has a lot of experience sailing around the harbour of Copenhagen, but not enough time to help me with the long legs of the trip, helped me move Ophelia from Lynetten to Kastrup Havn. We moved the masts onto Ophelia and then we left, with Ophelia leaving the harbour for the first time in at least 8 years.
Så er vi på vej. Lynetten til Kastrup.
The trip to Kastrup wasn't too far, though still further than puttering around the harbour of Lynetten, so I tracked the fuel used diligently. I had no idea how much diesel the engine used, and that seemed like a fairly important piece of information for the rest of the move. Ophelia hadn't and still doesn't have any functional electronics on board, so I used Navionics boating software on the phone to track distance and speed. This worked excellently, while I at the same time weighed the fuel tank with shortish intervals in order to calculate how much I'd used. Obviously, a chart plotter with more sensors would have been better, but there wasn't much point in investing a lot of money in electronics when actual sailing was, and still is, quite a bit off. For security, I borrowed my mate's dinghy and his grab bag with flares, a handheld radio and other assorted thingamajigs. 2 weeks after this short trip, it was time for the first long leg of the journey. Rather than going from Lynetten, we instead started from Kastrup by Copenhagen, and then we would end up at Klintholm on Møn, just about as far south and east as you can go in Denmark without having to cross the open water to Bornholm just south of Sweden. We set off from Kastrup and sailed down south along the coast of Amager, an island which is part of the greater Copenhagen area and which is also affectionately known as Crab Island, as it has been used by the nightmen of Copenhagen to empty the toilet buckets that they gathered in the city. Ophelia sailed splendidly and everything was going fine, until I learned about Ophelia's real fuel consumption, that is. I thought that I knew how much fuel she used after that first trip, but the calculations turned out to be wrong, and wrong by a lot. It turns out that we probably had a current helping us along, and with no speed through water measurement, we only had speed over ground. There was no way of knowing about that current, and so the calculations were off, and off by almost a factor of 2. I brought what I thought would be plenty of fuel, about double what we should be using, but we didn't get very far from the southern end of Amager and just into the first crossing of Køge Bugt before we had to board the crossing due to fuel concerns. It was a bit chilly, but we had almost perfect weather, and chancing it would probably have worked out, with us entering Klintholm Harbour just on the last bits of fuel, but it would simply be too close to comfort. Also, there would be no possibility of help from DSRS, the Danish Sea Rescue Society, the ones that towed Ophelia, on the second half of the trip, so when crossing the next bay, Faxe Bugt. Of course, we could have gotten help from the Marine Division of the Home Guard if we really needed it, but I'd rather not have to call on them for something as silly and avoidable as running out of fuel. I know it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I'd feel less bad about having to ask for help from a volunteer organization, of which I'm a paying supporter, than from a volunteer military organization, even though I do know that it would be more than happy to help as well. So instead of going south, we turned abruptly west at what I now call Point Nope, and went to Brøndby Harbour south of Copenhagen instead of Klintholm. Having landed in Brøndby and locked down the boat, we got a lift back to Kastrup Marina so that I could pick up my car and then head back to Brøndby once again. While we were sailing from Kastrup to Brøndby, we'd kept an eye on the heat exchanger and the way it was moving, and those vibrations clearly weren't doing anything good for the engine. We had a lot of crap coming loose, even a bolt, and it was just a mounting bolt for the bracket, but if the engine swallowed any of that dirt, or God forbid a bolt, we'd be in serious trouble. So the problem had to be fixed, and it seems to be the issue that the mounting bracket just couldn't stop the vibrations. At certain frequencies the heat exchanger looked like it would be shaking everything apart. All the bits that had been cut out of the bracket just left it too weak. So yeah, I decided to move the heat exchanger from the engine itself and onto the wall next to the engine. That would keep it perfectly still, and the hoses leading to and from the heat exchanger should be plenty able to absorb those vibrations, and well, that would solve the issue, or so I hoped. On the way from Kastrup to Brøndby, I therefore stopped at a home improvement store and bought some shelving brackets. With a bit of boat yoga and a lot of swearing, I mounted those on the wall next to the engine and moved the heat exchanger onto those brackets, reconnected the hoses. Well, Bob's your uncle, problem fixed. Yeah, hi, I just have to insert a short break here from the regular programming to say thank you. It's been amazing to have a brand new channel such as this take off as quickly as it has, and also a bit overwhelming, but it's all down to you guys, so thank you. Now, if you want to support this channel, you already are by watching this, so there's really no need to do anything further. But a couple of you have asked about a Patreon, so I've set one up and I'll leave a link for said Patreon down in the video description. Now, I'm not entirely sure what kind of benefits the patrons are going to get yet. I'm thinking something along the lines of live Q&A sessions and status reports, and possibly votes about video content and project direction. So well, I guess you'd call that user feedback, but I guess we'll figure it out along the way. At any rate, thank you. Having fixed the heat exchanger, I returned home to Marstal, and my mood obviously improved significantly when I encountered an unusually full ferry and had to wait for 4 hours before finally getting back home on the last ferry of the day. Yeah, and little did I know what was ahead. I didn't want to run the risk of, once again, not having enough fuel, so I decided to increase the amount of fuel I could carry by buying more fuel cans. I was running Ophelia off ordinary fuel cans because while there was a keel tank, I didn't trust it. It was about 60% full of diesel, but 100% full of potential trouble. That fuel had been sitting there for a long time doing nothing other than swishing back and forth, rocking gently with the boat, while there was plenty of oxygen and potentially water from condensation down there as well. So that stuff could be full of all kind of nasties, stuff that you didn't want to get into an engine at any rate. So I decided to leave it alone and just run off external tanks. I also decided that at this point I was comfortable enough with Ophelia that I didn't really need to have the engineer along, just an extra set of hands. Don't get me wrong, I would have loved to have him along, but he was working night shifts at this point more or less permanently, and the planning to get that in place would have been a nightmare. So I decided to go it alone with just me and a mate. We left Brøndby Harbour, which does require some careful navigation due to shallow water around the harbour entrance. I think the map has now been updated and no longer recommends Ophelia entering that harbour. The 44 nautical miles from Brøndby to Clinton were quite uneventful, with lots of shifting currents but very few waves. This was unusual but not unwelcome, as Køgebugt and Faxebugt both have a reputation for being quite nasty waters, with very confused seas that are often built on top of not insignificant swell. And we passed the famous, in Denmark at least, white cliffs of Møn and arrived at the idyllic town of Clinton. Having tied up at Clinton, we hurried up and shut Ophelia down, and then we ran towards the bus out of town and missed it by a hair. We then proceeded to wait what seemed like an eternity for the next bus, because Clinton is out in the middle of nowhere, and at least outside of the tourist season, the buses are far between. This was obviously something I could have checked before we set out from Brøndby, but I was still too used to the high-frequency buses of Copenhagen to even consider this possibility. We skipped a day before we returned to Clinton, where we refueled Ophelia, and then we set out into Hjelmbugt, I guess that could be translated into Helmet Bay, where we headed westwards towards Vordingborg. That would be our next destination. The water in Hjelmbugt was exceptionally quiet. It was almost like glass, and only a long soft swell could be felt. There was no wind and the sun was out, so we had more or less perfect conditions for the trip. A few miles out we encountered a purpose family group, something you don't see that often when going by engine because they don't like the noise, or, well, humans in general. But something must have attracted them to us because they tacked on for quite a while. Maybe it was the undersea garden that had likely returned to the hull of Ophelia. We turned north and entered the Storstrøm passage. Storstrøm can be translated as great stream or great current, and the name absolutely isn't without merit. The currents in there can be quite fierce. We were lucky though, and the currents were running in the direction we needed to go, and they carried us along with them. Navigating through the last bit of water from Storstrøm to Vordingborg was slightly nerve-wracking. Vordingborg is a bit to the side of the main Storström, and the dugout channel that leads from the great stream into town forms a set with quite sharp turns. When you have the draft that Ophelia does, you can only afford to go possibly a few meters outside the channel before you run the risk of running aground. While the bottom out there may be sand, or so I'm told, it's not really an exciting prospect to get stuck out in the middle of nowhere and have to wait for help. Add to that a quite often powerful and unpredictable current around the channel and you have a recipe for, well, for excitement. At any rate, Ophelia did well and we got through to Vordingborg without any kind of issues. There are 3 marinas in the area around Vordingborg, and I chose the one called Masnesund Havn or Masnesund Harbour because it's the one that's the closest to the main Storström channel. It also has the advantage that besides the enclosed marina area, it has a pier that goes alongside a channel, a quite deep channel. So if we couldn't go into the marina, we could go alongside instead. And that turned out to be a good choice because when we got close to the marina, I had this feeling that something wasn't quite right. Even though the map said that there should be plenty of water to go inside the marina, then turn right or left and we should be fine, I decided not to chance it and go alongside the pier instead. And the harbour master wasn't too thrilled about my choice because I was taking up a slot from someone quite a lot bigger than us that definitely couldn't go into the marina. Well, potentially because there were no one else around. At any rate, once she found out what the draft of Ophelia was, she changed her mind. And the thing was that we could have gotten just inside the opening of the marina, then we would have taken the bottom. We couldn't have gone neither left nor right, we would just have gotten stuck immediately. At any rate, I chose Vordingborg because it's a central hub for public transport in the area, and it should have been easy to go to and from Vordingborg. See, should have, because there's a big construction project, once again, a big construction project going on the Storström Bridge, and due to that, the entire transport system was in chaos. So we ended up having to wait quite a long time before we could get on a train out of town. Undeterred by the public transportation chaos, not that we had much of a choice anyway, we set out a couple of weeks later on the second to last, possibly even the last leg of this journey. This wasn't too long of a leg, and if we got lucky and crossed Storbælt quickly, the Great Belt, we could continue to Marstal after a short refueling stop at Spodsbjerg, which would otherwise be this leg's destination. Once again, we had perfect weather conditions. The sun was out, the water was flat, we had no wind, and we had plenty of fuel. We even had a fairly strong current flowing in the direction we wanted to go in, so we quickly left Vordingborg while enjoying the sights and the weather. We were also lucky enough to have a seal tag along, bopping around and keeping an eye on us for some of the trip. Everything was going perfectly until about 8 miles out of Vordingborg, then things went south. I could suddenly see some almost invisible tufts of steam or smoke coming from the control pedestal. The control pedestal also ventilates the engine room, so I rushed down the companionway doors and opened them, and immediately clouds of steam started billowing through the doors. Fortunately, it was just steam, so it wasn't a fire, but the heat exchanger was boiling. I thought that with some reason might have been low on cooling fluid, so I decided to pour some more water into the reservoir, but the water I poured in immediately started boiling and was pushed up and out of the reservoir. So we shut down the engine and came to a full stop in order to let the engine cool down. This, of course, killed the option of making it all the way home that same day. After bobbing around for a while, I refilled the cooling water and started the engine again. Within a few minutes we had the exact same issue as earlier, with the water in the engine boiling. A few further attempts at troubleshooting left us running low on water for the cooling, and the batteries didn't have much of a charge left. So I decided to call for help. Fortunately, we were close enough to land to use the phone, so I didn't have to use the VHF radio, which made things quite a bit easier. I got hold of the local DSRS station, and they quickly drummed together a crew, and 15 minutes after setting out, they arrived at Ophelia's position. So a couple of hours of sailing for us took them about 15 minutes. We were towed back to Vordingborg and ended up being moored in the exact same place we left from. It was really nice to be able to get help that quickly, but it was also quite a bummer that we needed to get help. DSIS document their rescues by taking pictures, so here's Ophelia being towed back to Vordingborg. Now, you have 3 guesses, and that's really too many to guess how well the public transport worked this time around. Yeah, the same thing as the first time. It took quite a while and a few trips from Marstal to Vordingborg to figure out what had gone wrong. In the end, it turns out that the thermostat on the engine was malfunctioning and didn't open at the temperature it was supposed to, which seems obvious in hindsight. And I also did have that idea quite early on, so I unmounted the thermostat and put it in a pot on the stove and checked if it opened as it was supposed to, and it did. So I put it back in and started looking for the issue elsewhere because, well, that wasn't broken, so something else must be. I even replaced the seal in the sea strainer because it had a small leak, and I thought that maybe that leak was enough to reduce the cooling water coming through. So yeah, that could be it, but no, it wasn't. And I kept poking around. And this was where that see-through hose from the heat exchanger into the engine that I mentioned in a previous episode would have come in quite handy. That would have shown the issue, because a non-opening thermostat of course means no flow of cooling liquid, which I ended up discovering when I took a hose directly from the heat exchanger into a bucket and then let the engine draw the cooling water from that bucket. And I could clearly see that with the thermostat in place, there was no flow. And then I removed the thermostat and there was plenty of flow. Problem diagnosed and fixed. I also ran into a few electrical issues along the way, but yeah, that's a whole nother matter. That's just poking around, charging batteries and switching battery and back and forth, but that was solved as well. And during all of this, the harbour master in Vordingborg had gotten slightly jittery. I think she might have been afraid of me just ditching the boat and going, screw it. But she was absolutely awesome. When we talked about the problem, she was quite understanding, and she did her absolute best to make sure that the stay at Vordingborg, which was quite a lot longer than I had expected, didn't cost me any more than it absolutely had to. So, with the problem solved, I was finally able to leave Vordingborg. But, yeah, the mate that had been along for the trip until Vordingborg and didn't have time. And my brother, well, he was still caught in night shift limbo, so that wasn't an option either. I was kind of like, crap. But I got lucky and found a helping hand on a Facebook group for people who wanted to sail along with others. And the one who responded to this was a dinghy driver in the marine division of the Home Guard. So she knew a thing or two about sailing. That was just excellent. It seems that spring and early summer is a good time for motor sailing in Denmark because once again we had no wind and flat water when we set out from Vordingborg. And yeah, well, however, it seems that the universe might have been trying to tell me something, because we weren't more than a couple of meters away from the dock when my phone was dropped from the control pedestal onto the softish teak deck. But even though it was just a short drop onto something not too hard, the screen broke. That was, of course, the phone with navigation software. So yeah, fortunately, I could reinstall the software and access my account from my helper's phone, so we had navigation. But this, of course, means that I don't have the exact track from this trip. Not being one to repeat previous mistakes, not too often at any rate, I carefully monitored fuel levels and engine temperature so I could nip it in the bud if things turned weird again. But when we approached the Great Belt, the diesel situation had become a bit questionable. We were once again quite clearly using more fuel than I expected, even with the corrected calculations. So I did the math with the new numbers from this trip, and we should have enough fuel to get across the Great Belt and to port, but it would be on a hair again. So if things went sideways out in the open and quite traffic belt, well, then we might use fuel even faster and we would get in trouble. In the end, I decided not to chance it and to drop in on the private island of Vary. The island of Vary has a hotel and a marina, and I expected it to also have tanking facilities at that marina, because, well, they usually are. But it didn't. All in all, it turned out well though, because the groundskeeper sold us a fuel can's worth of diesel at a quite fair price. So with that done, we could set out again. No sooner had we cleared the island and gotten into the open water before things changed quite significantly, and we were pounded by waves. Waves that were on average about twice the maximum height of the ones predicted by the forecast. So they'd been off by quite a bit. Not just me not being good at math. Before we set out, Ophelia had some planking on the bowsprit, just to make it easy to get on board, and then a couple of waves in, that planking was gone. Well, it was scattered around the deck as individual boards. And if you watched the walkthrough in the previous episode, you might also have noticed that Ophelia had a fairly big TV in the salon. I had tucked it a bit and see if it was secure, and I thought it was. It might even have been screwed down and I couldn't really move it. But a few big waves in and the TV took a tumble, right onto a piece of wood I had on hand for emergencies, and it went straight through the screen. Yeah, this trip was turning out to be slightly expensive. That was just the start of the excitement though. The Great Belt has a traffic separation scheme in place, with separate lanes for northbound and southbound traffic, and with a roundabout at the south end of the belt to send traffic in different directions. We needed to cross those lanes as orthogonally as possible, so we kept an eye out and tried to time it so that we would pass behind the large transport ships going up and down the belt and a good distance to the next one. One of the bigger ships, a passenger boat, apparently didn't think the rules applied to them though. We had just passed behind a huge container boat in the northbound eastern lane and were almost across that lane when things got, let's say, hairy. As we were almost through the eastern lane, we had our focus on a fairly large and fast ship heading south in the western lane as intended. She should pass in front of us with a fairly comfortable margin, so there was nothing to worry about really. That is, until suddenly that northbound passenger ship showed up clearly in the southbound lane. She was going fast and it seemed to be heading straight towards us. I assumed that she was aware and that she was not in her right lane. She was trying to correct the situation as we were still in the lane she was supposed to be in. If that was the case though, it would make her pass behind us. She didn't, because even as we got closer to the southbound lane, she was still heading directly at us. She had obviously spotted the large boat going south in a hurry and was turning to avoid it by heading even further into the southbound lane, and this maneuver was keeping her on a collision course with us. I ended up turning south as soon as we entered the southbound lane to be sure to avoid her, which brought us uncomfortably close to the big and fast one going south, but they were where they were supposed to. Now, clearly the passenger boat either hadn't spotted us, or they just figured that we would move out of the way. And they weren't wrong either. Even though they clearly weren't where they were supposed to be, I was sure as hell not going to take any chances with them. In the end, they turned even further west to avoid the southbound boat, and they passed both of us outside of either traffic lanes and outside the markings designating the channel as well. With that excitement out of the way, we entered Sparsby Marina, and we found that we were now so deep into the sailing season that most slips were taken by tourists. The only ones that were still free were the smaller ones in the lower end, and we couldn't use those because of Ophelia's draft. So we hung out a bit and looked for a spot, and then one of the locals started signaling and yelling, and he directed us towards a slip that would usually be reserved for a fairly big commercial boat. But it just happened that this local guy knew that the captain of this boat was gone and he wouldn't be back for at least a couple of weeks. So we got lucky and got an almost perfect spot that didn't require a lot of maneuvering inside the marina. So we closed up the boat and we didn't run for public transport because I parked my car at this marina. So for once, transport was easy. About a week and a half later, we left Sparsby, headed for Marstal, but not before dropping off a cup of craft beer at the friendly local guy's boat because, well, thank you for the help. At any rate, we left the harbour and the weather this time was downright boring, and the trip itself was also very uneventful. The only thing that did bring a slight bit of excitement was the last couple of 100 meters into Marstal harbour. There's a dugout channel that leads in there, and there's a quite powerful current out there. I'm told that the channel was dug out, but it does need to be maintained because the current maintains the channel. At any rate, the motor could handle it, so we just entered the harbor and found out that we were still deep in the sailing season. A big surprise there. And that, of course, meant that all spots were taken. I'd been assigned a spot by a friend of mine who works at the local shipyard, one of their spots. But that was taken by a German sailing tourist, and they are allowed to use those because, well, if no one's taken the spot, they can use it as long as they pay. So we cruised around a bit, and then we ended up finding a spot that was once again intended for a much larger boat, but we found a spot. And with that, Ophelia had arrived at a new home port of Marstal. Thank you for once again tagging along with me on this tale of Ophelia's resurrection and relocation. Next week, I'm going to have a look at what needs to be fixed on Ophelia and in which order things need to be done. So please click the subscribe button so you're alerted when I upload the next episode, and also please do click the like button. If you got this far, I probably didn't bore you completely out of your mind this time either. So I hope to see you next week.